We're going to reconvene our morning meeting with Kyle Landis and Thomas Nauer, both with the Public Utility Commission. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. Good morning. My name is Tom Nauer. I'm the Policy Director for the Public Utility Commission.
I'm Kyle Landis Marinello. I'm General Counsel at the Public Utility Commission. So we submitted some potential red lines for the committee's consideration. And if it's okay with the chair and the rest of the committee, we're just going to use that to kind of guide our testimony, but obviously chime in anytime with any questions that you have. So first off, just a general point that our agency is not taking a position on S5. The comments and red lines we're providing, the testimony we're providing today is just to show potential improvements to how it could be implemented if the legislature chooses to enact this bill. So the first place we have some suggested edits is in the section about how each obligated party chooses to meet its requirements and meet the amount of eligible clean heat measures that need to be retired. So this section, I apologize for some formatting issues in this document, but the change we recommend here would be to make it clear that the way that we're expecting people to meet their obligation is through delivery clean heat measures by a designated default delivery agent. And so that designated statewide delivery agent is going to be doing the vast majority of the measures is how we anticipate this will happen. And we want that to be the assumed way of compliance with the clean heat standard. We also have language in here that allows any obligated party to apply to the commission to petition us to meet their obligation through an alternative method, but they would need to do that ahead of time. And we would look at their proposal. There could be a lot of flexibility built into that proposal in terms of they could say, our plan is to meet it through this amount of a payment to the default delivery agent and this amount of other measures. But if the payment to the default delivery agent ends up being more than the other measures, we might lessen that and we would add these additional measures instead. We'd have some sort of plan ahead of time for how each obligated party meets its obligations. So it's in some ways a small change, but we think it's a really important one because particularly from an enforcement standpoint, this would make it much easier to implement and enforce if we get to a situation where it appears as though some entities haven't actually met their obligation.
Just to, so in this case, an obligated party would, let's say we heard from the fuel dealers yesterday, they would be an obligated party. You're imagining that they would be meeting the goal by going to one person who provides the services to make the transitions, or they individually would have to come to you and petition to become someone who helped in the transition.
Yes, correct. The bill as passed the Senate has this idea that there will be a statewide, one or more statewide default delivery agents. And so we really like that idea. The change that we're proposing kind of tightens up the requirements for an obligated party to do work on its own. The bill as passed the Senate allowed an obligated party to elect out. We think it would be better to have the commission review a plan by that party in advance and approve it so that we know that the obligated entity has thought about it, has the resources, is aware of the market conditions, et cetera. That's helpful both for the obligated parties and frankly, I think for the default delivery agents. It helps them know in advance what is the scope of work that they will be asked to do. Are they doing 10% of the statewide work or 100%. I think that'll just make implementation of this a lot cleaner.
Representative Sibilia.
Just along this same line. So the default delivery agent, I'm envisioning will be utilized probably more by small dealers who are not necessarily providing other clean heat measures to their customers. It's a smaller entity. So they'd just be providing that funding. And what this is saying is you would like that to be the assumption is that everyone will be using the default delivery agent. And then if you are not using the default delivery agent, you'll tell us what your plans are for meeting your obligation, not just saying we're going to do it our own, but give a little bit more information about how you're going to do it, how you're going to provide clean heat measures. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes, and I would just add, though, it's not just give us more information, it's submit a plan that we have to approve ahead of time. And again, a lot of this comes from, I've been at the commission about 5 years now, but before that, I spent about 8 years at the Attorney General's office, mostly doing environmental enforcement cases. And whenever you bring an environmental enforcement case, the other side comes up with a litany of reasons of why they actually did meet whatever requirements they are being charged with not meeting. And so when I look at a bill like this, a new program, a whole host of entities that have never interacted with us before, you just heard from the one entity that we do interact with on a regular basis, but all the other people being brought in as obligated parties who are not Vermont Gas are new entities to us. And we do have concerns and have from the beginning about compliance. And you want as close to 100% compliance as possible. Anyone who doesn't comply increases the cost for everyone else. So one of the ways you get a good compliance rate in a new program is to have very clear definitions of who's on the hook. The current bill does exactly that with the definition of obligated party. And we have a comment in here about how we like that definition. We think it's good. And we think this committee should stick with that definition of obligated party. And then second, you have very clear definitions of what the obligation is. And so this change here from may obtain the required amount of clean heat credits through, and then a list of measures allows for a lot of options if someone doesn't meet their obligation to come up with excuses why they didn't meet it. If you implement the change we're suggesting here, it takes all those excuses away. It says you must obtain the amount of clean heat credits through delivery of eligible clean heat measures by the default delivery agent, unless you've gotten prior approval from the commission to do something else. So then if we find someone hasn't met their obligation, it's a very simple enforcement action, whether it's in front of us or if it's the Attorney General's office going to Superior Court. And they just look, okay, are you an obligated party? Yes. Do you have a pre-approved plan to meet this through some other measure? No. Did you make a payment to the default delivery agent? No. It's clear as day that that's enforcement action that they're on the hook for to make right for failing to comply. So that's why we're suggesting this approach. We think it's going to simplify both the implementation and the enforcement.
Thank you.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just help me to try to understand. So the designated statewide delivery agent. What about those fuel dealers, the small dealers that actually go and pick it up and bring it back? What are they considered? And would they have to, in fact, go through that whole process with you individually?
So if a fuel dealer is picking up in-state, then the in-state entity that imported the fuel at the wholesale level is who has the obligation under this bill. If the fuel dealer is bringing the fuel in from out of state, then they're the importer of the fuels. And so they have the obligation and have to meet the requirement for clean heat credits based on how much fuel they're delivering to Vermont residents. And so under this approach, the way they would meet that requirement is, and I think as Representative Sebelia said, that the smaller fuel dealers we do expect would meet the requirement through a payment to the default delivery agent. And then the default delivery agent is actually going out and installing the clean heat measures in people's homes.
All right. Thank you.
I have a feeling we could probably spend a lot of time on just your first one. How many suggestions are in your document?
Yeah, it's not a lot more. This is the biggest
Okay.
change, I would say, but we do have some others that we would like to.
Yeah, so awesome. So Representative Pat and then Laura.
Yeah, so we had testimony from some fuel dealers yesterday, some of whom may be obligated parties or not, based on what you were just saying. But there are at least some fuel dealers in Vermont now who are, for instance, installing heat pumps. And I don't know whether they do that through contractors or their own employees or whatever. So they would, if they would need to, if they wanted to continue doing that, if they were an obligated party and wanted to continue, they would need to basically go to you and propose that, and you would need to take a look at what they do. Is that what I'm?
Correct.
Okay.
And I would just add, if they wanted the installation of the measures to be part of how they meet their obligation under this bill, they could also meet their obligation through a payment to the default delivery agent, and then they can simultaneously be a contractor with the default delivery agent to do that work and get paid from the default delivery agent for that. So they would have both those options.
Okay.
Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, gentlemen, for coming in and testifying. Can you speak a little bit? It's about the payments from the smaller dealers, and within the bill there is a 4 times penalty if they don't report. Do you have a comment on that? It seems kind of excessive for a small mom and pop dealer that potentially could. The penalty we heard yesterday could be more than what they're delivering. So I just wonder if you had a sense on whether the 4 times penalty is appropriate or reasonable.
I don't have a comment on that. It's a policy decision for lawmakers.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll say is that you do increase compliance in terms of getting people to register if there is a bigger penalty. And so there is a benefit from that standpoint. That, again, one of our big concerns is companies not even registering at all. And I believe Mr. Koda has testified to that as well, that is a real concern whenever you're adding an additional cost to existing businesses. And so that would be part of the policy considerations taken into account.
That's a fair answer. Thanks.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Have you seen program designs that, like, let's say for the first year, have a 2x penalty, and then the penalty increases as the assumption is that businesses become more aware of what they're supposed to be doing? Have you seen that type of program design, or?
Nothing's coming to mind.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. So I guess I will say there is a benefit to, we have an early registration deadline in here of, I think, January 31st, 2024. And we think that's an important part of the bill so that we know who are these entities that, again, we're not currently regulating them. So we need to know who they are. We're also trying to get their provisions in here to get more information from the tax department. Those are really important provisions so that we can match up, okay, based on the fuel tax that's being paid, here's how many gallons seem to be consumed in Vermont by Vermont residents. And then we're looking at the registrations and seeing, is that the same number or do we have a gap? And that'll be a good early indication of whether everyone who's supposed to register has in fact registered. And so I do think there is that worry about how do you get the word out and make sure that it happens. But I would hope if if this bill is passed, that there would be an effort to do that early on. And these entities aren't currently regulated by us, but they are highly regulated. They do need to be filing tax forms every 3 months, I believe, on all the gallons that they're selling in Vermont, at least at the retail level. And so we would know who those entities are based on who's doing those filings. The wholesale entities in Vermont are not currently paying those taxes because they're done at the retail level. And so we would need to make sure we're capturing who those entities are. But one of the things that's in this bill that's really important is it requires those tax forms to be changed so that the retail providers say who they bought how much fuel from. And then if they list a wholesaler in Rutland and we look at our list of registrations and don't have that entity registered with us, we know we need to get them on board.
Thank you. This is just a minor change, but the definition of a low-income customer seems to need some additional language because later on in the bill in 81-24-D6, there's a reference to customers who qualify for government-sponsored low-income energy subsidy. So it seems like the intent is to group them together in the group of low-income customers, but we think some additional language would be helpful there. As I noted earlier, we do think it's important to keep this clear definition of obligated party. Just a note that we agree with the Office of Racial Equity about moving the reference to translation services to another section of the bill. In their comments, they have that spelled out. And then we noticed on the temporary suspension, it was originally drafted with the not to exceed 18 months put in there. But as the bill developed in the Senate, it's moved to 3 cycles for the potential study and looking at the amount of work that's done in a 3-year period. And so we think if there's going to be a provision like this that allows for a pause, that it would probably make sense for that pause to be for the full 3-year period. Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, thanks. Kyle, I want to make sure I really grasp this and the interconnection with the other pieces. So if we can even bring this down a little bit more to the near mortal level explanation. Can you walk through that again?
Yeah, so this is this provision here is
Actually, I want to interrupt you for 1 second for the committee. So this piece here, I have labeled as a circuit breaker, and I think there are 2 where when something goes awry, you have a chance to stop. We could talk more about that. So I want to understand what you're doing to the circuit breaker here and how it connects to other things.
Yeah, I'm glad you interrupted me because I was having trouble thinking of that phrase. That's what I was looking for, a circuit breaker. That, this is a provision that's saying, there are a lot of unknowns about what the ultimate cost is going to be of the clean heat standard. And so when we dive into this, if we're given this to implement, we may find that there's good cause to pause the implementation until there's a larger workforce, or there are different reasons given here why a pause might happen. And so if that pause is triggered, then we do think it might make sense to have a 3-year pause because the entire 3-year cycle it would be hard to start halfway through that.
I would like to use a slightly different word rather than pause. I would say maybe throttle down, because let's say we want to achieve the emissions reduction, the full amount of emissions reductions, but a potential study or market factors might indicate it's not technically feasible. The workforce isn't there. There might be a number of factors that indicate getting 100% of our goals over the next 3 years just isn't there. And so I'd say throttle down, to some fraction, 90%, 80%, something like that.
I think that's important because I heard pause and I was like, what are we stopping the whole thing? That seems pretty disruptive.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that clarification. Tom's right about that.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Do we have I hear your point. I guess I feel like 3 years is a lot. Is that consistent with our other performance standard programs like the renewable energy standard, or it's not quite a performance standard, but the efficiency utility requirements?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of anything in statute that sets a specified period when we would change. I believe the renewable energy standard law does say on petition of an electric utility, we could change its annual obligation. Off the top of my head, I don't have the res statute memorized, so I couldn't say if it's a temporary amount of time or if there's any temporal element to it. And I'm fairly certain that there's no statutory provision governing the energy efficiency obligation. I know that if market conditions change material within a 3-year performance period, an efficiency utility could file with the Public Utility Commission and just say, hey, during COVID, someone could have filed and say, we just can't get into people's homes right now or businesses. And so we need to change what we're doing. We thought we'd be doing X. We need to do a little bit less than X. That option is always on the table for the efficiency utilities.
Representative Tory.
Thank you. What would it look like for you to make that decision? What form would that take?
It could be that when the Department of Public Service files the potential study and we workshop that with stakeholders, we might discover that there are very real world conditions that would dictate, exercising the statutory provision, throttling down, using the phrase I used a few minutes ago.
And I do think that would be in the form of an order that the commission would issue. Yes. So the commission operates through rulemaking and through orders. And there is we have some suggested that it's later on about when we can use which forms. And I think, but I will put out there that whichever form we use, our agency is a creature of statute. And so if we ever do anything that the legislature doesn't like, the legislature can always pass a bill that overrides any decision we've made. And so that could happen if we issue an order throttling back to, let's say, 80%, and the legislature thinks it should have only throttled back to 90%, then they could always pass a bill that directs us to ratchet it back up to a higher level. This is kind of just a technical change that on the information the Department of Taxes has to provide us. We realize there isn't a specific deadline in there, so we thought that would be helpful to add that in. Similar change.
Representative Bonner.
Can we go back to that, the 18 months?
Yes.
And I'm just noticing, I hadn't focused on this before, but the last sentence in that paragraph.
Yep.
What if it was COVID and you had to throttle back to 50% or whatever? That actually would materially affect. So is there a conflict?
Yeah, there could be. So this, and just so everyone's aware, the reference to 10 VSA section 578, A2 and A3, those are the 2030 and the 2050 requirements under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so I think it's really the A2, the 2030 requirement, where this could come into play, that if we have a pause in the early state, or not pause, a throttling back in the early stages, how much we throttle back would be dependent on whether we think it can be done and still meet the 2030.
And yet if it's not technically feasible, so I mean, is it possible you could have the conflict where it's not, you determine that for whatever reason, it's not technically feasible, and yet if you do that because it's not technically feasible, it will materially affect. Is there a conflict in this? I just want something we need to look at. That's all I wanted to know. Okay.
Yeah, I think that there is that possibility.
So,
Representative Sibilia.
yeah, just on this point. So this is a place where the potential study is kind of telling us what's possible. And to Representative Bondgart's question about COVID. So, we've got the potential study. It's telling us what's possible with regards to the 2030 goals, meeting the 2030 goals. COVID hits. And one of the many emergency measures that we pass on the floor as, okay, sorry, your targets that were lined up with the potential study on a different set of, in a different world, those need to be ratcheted down. So that's an emergency measure that could further ratchet that down. Yes?
Yes, and I think that likely is what would happen if we found ourselves in that situation, that we would come to the legislature and say something needs to give.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. As this is written, it is clear that any ratcheting down that we make cannot materially affect the ability to meet those Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. So I mentioned these are just technical changes on the deadlines for the tax department. This is the provision I referenced earlier, where we have in here that if a customer qualifies for government-sponsored low-income energy subsidy, then those.
Say what page? Oh, page 12.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry. That those clean heat measures would qualify as being delivered to low-income customers if they qualify for a government-sponsored subsidy. So now page 17. These changes are related to what we testified about earlier, about instead of allowing the obligated party to elect how it's going to meet the requirements, they would need to get approved in advance what their plan is. And we do anticipate that the larger entities like Vermont Gas, some of the larger wholesale entities that are obligated parties, are likely to file a petition with us to ask for meeting the requirement in a different way. And the smaller entities are more likely to make a payment to the default delivery agent. And some of this too, and you'll hear after us from a representative from Efficiency Vermont, which may be one of the designated default delivery agents. Whoever is in that role needs to know how many heat pumps, weatherizations, additional work they need to do to meet whatever's being asked of them. And so we have something in here about whenever we would approve a plan for an alternative way of meeting the clean heat standard, the designated default delivery agent or agents would be informed of that and told that you're not going to be getting a payment from this entity because they're doing renewable natural gas or some other method of compliance in whole or in part.
I'll talk about this note. This is where the commission is setting the cost per credit that an obligated entity would pay to the default delivery agent. And right now the bill has the commission providing not less than 120 days notice of that credit cost to obligated entities. And there's a bit of tension here. So I don't, we don't have we could live with 120 days. It allows obligated entities some time to think about, what's the best business case for me? Is it to do the work on my own? Is it to work with the default delivery agent? Is it to go to the market? But the consequence of giving 120 days is that really we might be setting the credit cost on stale information, because in practice we'll be using cost data at the end of 1 year to set the per credit cost 2 years in advance. So if the 120 days were shortened in the bill, or if it allowed the commission to shorten that, if the commission found that it would provide better data to the obligated entities and to the default delivery agent, I think that might be helpful.
Representative Bonders.
Before we move on from this page, back in the blue, if you will, in the plan, what's the standard of review for the plan?
I'm sorry, say that again.
The obligated party submits a plan.
Yep.
To not have to pay into the default. What's the standard of review? Is it reasonable, the standard?
I think that we would essentially be looking at, okay, what is their obligation? How many gallons of what type of fuel are they delivering? And we would be looking at their plan for how to meet the credits. The tag would be in the technical advisory group would be informing us on which measures cause what reductions. And so instead of thinking about in terms of a standard, I would think about almost as a mathematical exercise that we would be looking at, okay, this is what reduction they need to meet. And here are the measures they've proposed that has to line up and actually cause the reduction if they're substituting payments to the default delivery agent with some other method of compliance.
Would you also be looking at and considering whether you believe they have the ability to do what's in the plan?
Yes, that would be something we'd look at as well.
That be a reasonableness standard when you're looking at that portion of the?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to characterize it. Yep.
I think the details of that review we would work out, in the engagement process that we could be conducting in the next 18 months. It is important to establish what are we reviewing when those plans are submitted, and so the parties know in advance what it is.
And I should mention also that I said we do things in two different ways, through rulemaking and through orders. Whenever we issue an order, it is subject to appeal to the Vermont Supreme Court by any party that's adversely affected by it. And so there is always that check on there that if someone submitted a plan and we rejected it and they disagreed with the rationale for our rejection, then there could be an appeal mechanism available to them there. Tom, do you want to mention this one?
Sure. I'm recommending the insertion of the words "at least," and basically this is, we're commencing a proceeding potentially in a few months from now, and working at a breakneck pace for a year and a half to get this thing up and running. And the bill currently has us opening a proceeding at least every 3 years, to establish the per credit cost. And we at the commission and everyone who's involved, we're likely to have some learning in the course of the first year or two. So it may be advisable to have us open a proceeding sooner than 3 years from the commencement date to update that credit cost.
I think a lot of these changes are aimed at giving us more flexibility because, so in my role as general counsel, one of the things I do is advise the commissioners on what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And as I said, we're a creature of statute. So if we can't do something, we can't do it. even if every single stakeholder comes to us and says, hey, we need to update this. As the bill's written now, we look and say, it says every 3 years. But if you add the words at least every 3 years, then we have that flexibility to do that if it makes sense. So now we're into the rulemaking section. And I think some of the changes we're suggesting here are the result of the way that the bill moved through the Senate, that there were some changes after it left Senate Natural Resources. And some of those that led to some, I don't know if I want to say inconsistency, but it's some tension between some of the different sections. And this is one where we do think there was kind of a broad-based check back provision that was added in the Senate. And we have some comments on that later on. But the way it's worded, it might actually preclude us from issuing orders at all during the interim period. And so, and it could also prevent us from changing the rules down the road again, even when all of the stakeholders come to us and say, we need a tweak to the rules. So this is just making clear that we can issue orders or take other actions, even if there's a requirement for legislative approval before the actual standard goes into effect. So again, this is a policy decision. If the policy decision is we can't do that, legislature obviously can do that, but then it's going to raise a lot of questions. Like if January 31st of 2024, no one registers with us, we can't do anything about it. And so I think having some flexibility to be able to, for instance, start an enforcement action or go to the Attorney General's office, ask them to bring enforcement action against entities that clearly are delivering fuel but haven't registered. All that would be put on pause if the current version is passed, or at least that would be one interpretation of it. And we don't think that was the intent of the Senate. It could be that was, but that's not the sense we have from our understanding of that provision. Okay, we're almost at the end here. This is a related change that in the rulemaking authority, this provision was added on the Senate side after it had left the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And again, it currently says shall not file proposed rules with the Secretary of State or issue any orders implementing the clean heat standard without specific authorization acted by the General Assembly. So at a minimum, we recommend scratching the phrase or issue any orders. And then we also just have a general comment on that approach. And so we've raised 3 overall concerns with it. So the first one is if we don't have the authority to go forward with the clean heat standard, then that could be a barrier to getting full and active participation by all of the stakeholders in the rulemaking process. And we also just have a concern about we're hiring 3 new people to help us with this program, and there's funding in there for that, and we greatly appreciate that, and we hope that nothing changes about that part of the bill because we're a small agency. We're 25 people, including the 3 commissioners. So we need 3 new people to help with this new program. But our ability to attract the best talent to fill those positions could be impacted when there are questions about whether the program will ever actually go into effect and questions about the long-term funding. right now there's funding for 1 year for those positions, but and a proposal, we come back to the legislature to look at long-term funding. But the long-term funding isn't there now. We asked the Senate for the long-term funding to be in this bill. It didn't happen. So a second concern is just about setting a precedent of going forward with a full rulemaking process and then needing to come back to the legislature for that approval. It's a big deviation from the well-established Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules process. So just a concern, does that become the norm for rulemaking at our agency or others? And then the third thing is just we have a concern about the uncertainty over what our authority is in the meanwhile. So I gave one example of if entities fail to register, it's not clear if we can do anything about that. So as I mentioned before, I have a background in enforcement. If you really don't want people to do what you're asking them to do, don't give the regulatory authority any ability to do anything about it when they fail to comply. And so again, a minimum, if this type of check back provision stays in place, we would want it changed so that it's clear we can issue orders in the meanwhile, even if the standard itself can't go into effect.
Yeah, so does the issue, does that alleviate this concern, or it's still there? Your concern if we make the changes proposed earlier around the issuing of orders?
It goes a long ways toward alleviating some of these concerns that we've raised. It still leaves a lot of uncertainty out there that I think is going to impact how much full participation, active participation we get from all the stakeholders when we're doing the rulemaking process.
That was really along the lines of my question.
Representative Sebelius. I mean, Stebbin.
Oh. I have to take a deep breath.
Yeah. Seen.
Do you have some suggestion, if typically what it is rulemaking and then it goes to LCAR, and what this is proposing is essentially a legislative approval. Do you have some other suggestion that might meet in the middle there?
I think that's what the original version of S5 as it was introduced this session was attempting to do, where we'd have to file the rules January 15th of 2025 with the legislature, but there's a pause, and this is a true pause, not a throttling back. We couldn't file it with the Secretary of State till July 1. And so that gives the legislature a full session to look at, okay, here's what the commission is proposing. Are we going to step in and stop that? Again, I will mention the legislature always has that authority. And so that's why I think you have the LCAR process where, the way that works is at the end of the day, an agency can go forward with a rule, even if there's an objection by LCAR. I'm only aware of one time when that's ever happened. And I think it was an kind of an emergency circumstance and unique circumstances. Generally, if LCAR is objecting to a bill, it's enormous pressure on the agency to change it and address LCAR's objections, because if the agency goes forward with a bill that LCAR is objected to, then anyone can challenge that in court, and the presumption of validity that a rule normally has is out the window. And with a program like this, there's significant moneyed interest that would likely challenge something like that. And they would have there'd be no presumption of validity. That rule, yes, we could go forward with it, but at the end of the day, it's probably not likely to survive a court challenge if that happens. So we do think there's that type of check back already through the LCAR process. There's the ability of the legislature to step in at any point and stop us from doing anything that we're doing if we're going in a direction the legislature didn't want us to go in. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a balancing act where this is a first in the nation program. There's going to be a lot to figure out. We're going to need to hear from all the stakeholders about how to make this work. And we're going to need a lot of flexibility in how to implement it. And the more the legislature is getting involved after that process has started, the more that can impact our ability to actually go forward and do what we think is the best program we can do. And we have very talented people at the commission. They take very seriously meeting any statutory requirements that are put on us and looking at legislative intent and implementing legislative intent. And so that's what we would be doing if we're given this program. And if we ever strayed from that, there are a lot of checks in place where the legislature could step in and change course or stop us at any moment.
Yeah. I'm curious if the timeline in the bill is introduced, rules can often take more time than we imagine. Is it a realistic timeline if we did go back to the original timeline and then you had to submit by January 1 and then there was that pause of 6 months? Could you realistically meet that January 1 deadline in the original bill?
I think it was, January 15th was the deadline, and we would be using those additional 14 days. It would be right up to the wire for sure. I mean, it is a very tight schedule as it is, but we would meet that deadline or make every effort. And if we thought we couldn't meet it, then we'd come to the legislature and say we needed a change.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, so there's been some concern that I have heard about the legislature being presented as part of this process that we've configured together a final rule to vote on that if we don't like, there's nothing we can do about. So then the legislature can't make changes. And I've been working with Ledge Council to better understand that. I don't believe that that's the case. I believe there are actually a lot of options for the legislature when the final rule comes, if we don't like it. Can you tell us what options are available in this check back scenario with the legislature when the rule comes, if the legislature does not like what they say?
Sure. So if the bill as it came out of the Senate is what's there, then that's interesting. That could actually create some restrictions. The way it's written now, the bill is saying that rule that we proposed can't be finalized until there's an approval of the legislature. I haven't fully thought through what that means. I've been focused more on S5 as it was introduced with the January 15th proposal. And if the language went back to that, where we would be able to go ahead and file on July 1st, 2025, unless the legislature steps in the meanwhile, we give the legislature, here's the final rule on January 15th. The legislature could pass a one-line bill that says, notwithstanding these other provisions, the commission shall not file that, go forward with the clean heat standard, and the whole program is dead. So it has that option. It can do nothing, and then we would go forward and do the rules. And I would not recommend the legislature does this because, again, this goes to a process concern, a kind of precedent concern of rules going before the entire legislature to be tweaked. But I do think under the S5 as it's introduced, the legislature could easily craft a bill that says any rules filed by the commission with the Secretary of State regarding the clean heat standard may not include the following or must include the following, and give us changes that would need to happen to that rule. And then that might mean under the Administrative Procedure Act, we'd have to restart the process. Although again, the legislature could say, notwithstanding the Administrative Procedure Act, they can go forward with these rules as long as the following changes are made. The Administrative Procedure Act is a default provision. The legislature can change those requirements at any time. So under S5 as it was introduced, I do think there would be a lot of flexibility in how the legislature addresses the rules that they're handed. But again, we wouldn't recommend going that route. And what you would hear from the commission 2 years from now, whether it's Tom and me or other people in these seats, is that this was a long process with a lot of stakeholders. Lots of the pieces fit together in ways that the legislature might not fully understand, having not gone through that long rulemaking process. And so I think the strong preference would be a kind of up or down vote if the legislature were looking at that 2 years from now.
One other question, just can you talk about, I believe the process that we would be looking at is you present us with a rule. We would have to vote. And then it would go to LCAR, which is also kind of a weird thing. But I think that's the process that we have in here that the Senate sent us.
The process the Senate sent, yes, does require a vote, but I'm sorry, you said, and then it would go to LCAR?
Yes. So it would not go to LCAR before the vote. It would go to LCAR after the vote. I believe that's the case.
Yeah, that may be. It does seem it's not entirely clear why the LCAR process would be needed if the whole legislature has approved it. And so it might be, if that provision stays there, that it would make sense to say that the other provisions, the Administrative Procedure Act, wouldn't need to be required at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe all that we had. This is just another place we've flagged where the reference to specific authorization by the General Assembly has been added. And this is what I referenced earlier about how the clean heat standard rulemaking provisions, if earlier in the bill, there's an ability that we would have to propose rules that would go through the normal rulemaking process that would allow amendments to those same rules to be done outside of the normal rulemaking process. And that's in provisions, section 8126 C and D. And there's other checks and balances that are put in place in those sections where we would have notice and comment. There would be an ability for anyone to challenge a change to the rule at the Vermont Supreme Court if they thought the rule change didn't make any sense. But if 8126 C and D remain, and we think those are important provisions, then we think this is an important change to make in this section. And just to back up for a second, the reason the Senate added in that flexibility to the rulemaking to have an alternative process for amending those rules is because, as Tom and I both mentioned, this is a first in the nation program. We're going to be learning a lot as it goes on if we're given this task. And we don't want to be in the situation of all of the stakeholders telling us, hey, we thought that rule would work as it was, but now we need this slight change and our hands are tied. We need to go through the lengthy rulemaking process to get a change made, and it can't go into effect right when we need it to. And so there's some flexibility built in there, but to actually have that flexibility, we need this change as well. And then just some 1 month additional time to propose suggested revenue streams so that that date lines up with, on the next page, there's a report to the committees of jurisdiction due on February 15th, 2024. So that covers it.
Thank you for that substantive testimony. Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quick question. Regarding the guardrail, coming back to the legislature, once the plan is designed before it's implemented, and I may misspeak a little bit. I understand that you have concerns for constituents as well, or customers. But I think this was put in because if the plan comes back and the price per unit measure of the fossil fuel and the credits that would be paid, the level of credits, whether it's 50%, 90% for installations, which I think is part of the charge here, just comes back and it's enormous. We have to answer to constituents and customers. You don't necessarily, the PUC doesn't necessarily answer to the customers. You have a charge to meet a goal. So I think that's why the guardrail was put in there. And I don't know if you have a comment on that. I didn't misspeak, and I don't mean to be insulting at all. You guys have an enormous responsibility if this thing was to pass. So it's appreciated. Just concerned that if this comes back and it becomes undoable in a lot of customers' minds, we have to answer to that. So the guardrail was put in, I believe, for that reason, that we wanted to have the opportunity to speak. I don't know what the result would be if we didn't approve the plan and what we would do to go back, but obviously we'd have to make some adjustments to something, either the goals, amount of reductions, or something. But we're also bound by statute that we implemented a few years ago that we need to do this. I don't know if that point's clear, or if you have a comment. Suggesting we remove the guardrail, is that what I'm hearing?
The guardrail of the check back.
The check back with the legislature.
We don't have a policy position on that. We just do have concerns with how it's drafted in the precedent that sets. And so, over the next 2 years, I think we would get a lot more clarity on what the costs are actually going to be. And so, as I said before, the legislature always has the ability to step in at any point. And, this bill could be changed to put some sort of another circuit breaker in there. If the costs were above a certain amount, then we can't go forward. There's precedent for doing that. Or the legislature, I'm sure, would hear from constituents if the price is going to be more than what was anticipated. And the legislature, as I said, can pass a very simple bill, one sentence that says Public Utility Commission shall not implement the clean heat standard, and everything stopped in its tracks. And so those are the types of guardrails that are more common, that there's more precedent for that, and that don't raise these same concerns that we have over how S5 is now. But as I said, we don't have a policy position at the end of the day on whether to do it this way or a different way.
Thank you.
I know you have a question, but I'm just going to follow up real quick. The precedent that exists for the cap is where?
Do you know examples?
One example would be in the renewable energy standard. There's a concept called the alternative compliance payment, and that kind of sets the ceiling on what an electric utility would pay for a credit of compliance for renewable electricity. So that really sets the goal of we're going to, they want to do work or procure credits at a lower cost. But there's a ceiling that says, this is the maximum amount that you'll pay to comply.
Thank you. Representative Sabine.
To Representative Morris's question, when we passed 715 last year, which was the original version of the clean heat standard prior to improvements that I think have been made, we heard concerns about the legislature needing to be more active in the authorization of it. But as we've heard from the PUC, we just have to do our jobs. Like if there's a problem, we can walk in, introduce a bill and say, we don't like this, we want to change this, we want to stop this. We can already do that. And that need last year was expressed by the governor. The Senate actually put in the checkback provision, which we ultimately agreed to and voted on last year. So a checkback provision so that we would have to look at, the work and then take an affirmative vote. And the bill was still vetoed last year. So this was taken into consideration in the drafts that were brought forward this year, in that there was this pause that we've heard discussed that was proposed as part of the original S5 and the bill that we have on our own, so that the rulemaking, all of that would come, and it would January there'd be a pause. And that pause would allow us to do our jobs. So we could be concerned and pass legislation to address those concerns, or we could not be concerned and not, again, the Senate has added in this check back to make sure that we do our jobs. And that's my interpretation of what's going on here. I hear the PUC saying, when you add in additional guardrails to make sure that you do your job, it does create some challenge for us in trying to give you what you've asked for. So with this, that's what I think I've heard today with this check back piece. And I have some sympathy for that. Nonetheless, it's what the Senate has sent us twice.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. If you have other questions, please let us know.
Hey, members,